Well, today, director compensation update. You know, it can seem quite enviable to set one's own pay, as directors do, but it can also be fraught with peril. Just ask the board of Facebook, which is now facing shareholder litigation over its pay. It's just one of those areas where a board can get dragged into the spotlight very quickly. Well, our moderator, Brett Longnecker, is chairman and CEO of Longnecker & Associates. His firm provides expert consultation in executive and director compensation, and as he has said to me on so many occasions, and so much more. They also consult with companies on a wide range of financial, corporate governance, and management issues. Brent is himself a highly experienced executive and a highly experienced director of public and private companies. And on top of all that, he's a mixed martial arts sensei and a champion ballroom dancer. He was out there on the dance floor last weekend on a bad hip. So he's a gamer all the way, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brent and let him get going.
Well, thanks, Rob. Tim is VP of Engineering for Brigo. He's also Director of Cirrus and Asset Intertech. I always like to get little things about people that's kind of unique. He's been married for 25 years. He has 5 kids, and 2 sets are boy and girl twins. I have 5 daughters, so I thought we might be playing poker here, and I think he won. He's also an avid baseball player and still plays in the men's league, which is really very, very cool. On the far side is Ross Burdorf. He is the CTO for Home Away, director and also on the comp committee of American National Bank, a really cool thing called the Santa Fe Institute that we were talking about, KLRU, and also a company called Book a Batch. Also very interesting, again, married 30 years, 3 kids. He's a marathon runner, and he also is an artist with metal. So again, very cool that, oftentimes we just talk about the professional things that people do, but it's often what really defines them is what they get to do later on in life. Very cool. Good to have you guys with us.
Thank you. Thanks.
Before we start, you think about director compensation. Compensation seems to be always in the news. I've got a good friend out of Harvard named Jay Lorish, who's probably considered the best governance person in the world. And when I was with him about 3 years ago, it was interesting because he said, the most important concept of compensation, the most element, is director comp. I will promise you that everybody will attack your executive comp. He said there's an absolute corollary to it. And when you start to think about how important that is, and some of the topics that we talked about, and we've been preparing for this for about a month, getting director comp right is very important. The Citrix case just recently came out from the Delaware courts, where I found it interesting in that they decided to do something that a lot of companies do. They just basically followed suit with their executive compensation equity plan that allowed for a grant of 1 million shares to like the CEO, but the fact that they didn't limit them in a subset or an amendment to that plan, the courts found them somewhat guilty of the fact that they could have had a corporate waste of assets, that they needed to do something more. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. So that's why I think today, when Ralph called about 7-8 months ago to talk about the fact that we needed to talk about director comp, I think he, the Austin chapter, and TriCities was way ahead of its game. So with that, let's get to it. Tim, let me ask you first, what's more important, director or executive pay, when you're sitting there thinking about it as a director and as an executive?
Right, well, I guess based on your opening comments, it must be director pay.
I wasn't trying to lead the witness.
Honestly, I've never thought of it. I think the performance of the company is the most important thing. That's the best thing you can do for the shareholders. So in my mind, and being the chairman of the comp committee, most of our thought when it comes to compensation is about the executive pay and making sure that we have the talent on board we need, that we retain that talent, and that they're getting fairly compensated for the performance they deliver for the company, the employees, and of course, most importantly, the shareholders.
Right.
Now, having said that, of course, director comp is an important topic, and it's a very interesting discussion in the Cirrus Logic case, which is a public company here in Austin. The compensation committee sets that. It's not a full board activity, and so you're, like you said, you're sitting there deciding what to pay yourself. So you have to set the right tone when you do that. Not just the way ISS might look at that, or litigators out there might want to look at that, but really the company and the executives themselves, do they have a board that's there? But I think really it's ultimately about the performance of the company, so it's the executive pay that takes precedence in my mind. We got to get that right.
Ross, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it depends, Brent, in that, you know, the size of the company. I think with smaller startups or private stuff that I'm involved with, you know, the executive pay is paramount because you're really trying to get this business up and running. I think with bigger companies, I think there's a lot more liability and there's more at stake for the board members. So I think you can see where the comp of the board can come together with the executive in either structurally or even financially. You know, I think that's my answer.
Well, and it's also interesting, you know, Tim mentioned ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services, and I know out in our audience we have both public, private, and not-for-profit boards. Private companies are clearly putting in a whole lot more boards than ever before, that's for sure, for governance purposes. But it's going to be interesting, Tim, that you mentioned ISS, because ISS has really never looked at board comp, but they are going to start to look at it. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of the analytics they come up with, because then those analytics will flow down to the private sector that will then flow down to the not-for-profit. So again, for the first time in a long time, board pay is coming to the forefront. I'm not going to disagree with Tim as far as executive pay, but board compensation, as you can imagine, as we'll talk about today, can have an interesting optic as it relates to the executives that you're in charge of. Ross, let me ask you, does it matter to executive management how a board is compensated? Should management have a say in that process?
Well, I mean, you can't talk about, I was thinking about this last night, Tim, you can't really talk about board compensation or anything on boards without really putting it, for me, really seating it firmly in governance. I mean, whenever I'm making a decision in a board level, I'm always thinking about governance is the starting point. So with that, I'm thinking of what I call the red face test, you know, and I always go to the worst case. I'm up on the stand, there's a jury there, and the judge, and you know, I've got to be honest about this. Does it pass the red face test? So when it comes to the whole set of compensation, I think can it be audited? And I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but you know, the comp committee I think obviously should set the pay for a board, and I think the interaction with the executive staff should be the partnership with the head of the comp committee on the executive staff would be your head of HR. And you should follow best practices and, you know, and to your comment before, really establish best practices so that it can stand up to scrutiny. The last thing you want is to have some kind of the sense of a sweetheart deal anywhere around. So I think the most visibility is better. So to answer your question, absolutely, yes, they should be involved in that discussion.
And Tim, let me ask, I'll add a little color, and again, Ralph's right, I've done this for 30 years as far as consulting. Probably about 8 years ago, Tim, I had a client up in North Texas, large oil and gas company, and we were doing all the executive pay, and I asked, naturally, I said, well, how would you like us to do the board pay? And the management team looked at me and said, oh no, we do the board pay. We want them to know where their bread is buttered so they always take care of us. We would soon resign that account. They are now no longer in business. But talk a little bit about that, because that's probably the exaggerated side of what we're talking about. But talk a little bit about that.
Well, my perspective on the management, I think you should have an engaged board. This is different, broader than compensation. They should be engaged with the management team. And in that sense, the management team, particularly the executive management team, has a voice into the performance of those board members and how well they think they're doing. Strictly on the pay element, I don't think that's as relevant as is their feedback on the performance of those board members.
See, now that's an interesting point, because again, having done this for so many years, you know, there was a day, and some of you probably remember this, when it was not unusual. The Wall Street Journal would write about certain people in the United States that were sitting on 12 public boards. Now just think about that for a minute, 12 public boards. They would also be the CEO or managing partner of a law firm. And you start to think about how cumbersome or how hard that would be. So back to what you're talking about, management wanting to make sure that somebody's engaged, because when somebody would do some analysis on that, a lot of times it was just a phone call in, but they never came and visited the company. And so we've moved away from that prayerfully, thankfully, good. I mean, well, I'm thankful for that, but that's what used to happen. So I think that you're right. Now, one thing that's not on our list of questions, but I've heard you all talk about it. Does it matter where the compensation is set? Because certain companies will put it in the nominating governance committee. Some will put it into the executive committee, especially if it's a bigger board, like a Fortune 500. And some will put it in the comp committee. And some will actually have in their charter, whichever one that is, it will still go as a recommendation to the full board to basically approve. Tim, first with you, thoughts?
I would say that as long as, like Greg Ross said, as well a nice, documented, reasonable process is followed, the actual vote really doesn't matter as much. In the difference between a nominating and governance committee looking at the compensation matters, not that those people could not do that. You know, in my opinion, the compensation committee, that's what they're dealing with year round. They're trying to stay up to speed with the latest regulations, the latest scrutinies, the latest scorecards from places like ISS and what they mean. So to me, it naturally falls into what they're doing with, you know, these boards can be tough on board members because they're not in your day job, and getting up to speed every time is a reality. So why not keep it in the realm of the people that are tasked with that area of expertise? So,
You know, boards need to be compensated, in my opinion, along with the executives. And, you know, the oversight of the executive comp is done by the board, and you know, that, I'm coming back, that's the head of HR at the company sets the standard for the company, and we don't want all of our executives at the 100th percentile. You know, it depends on what your philosophy is. Is it the 50th, 60th, 75th percentile, and then comped with, you know, stock options overall? I mean, I think those have to be aligned to come to your, I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg.
Right.
If you're focused on, you know, motivating the executives, which is where my take is, then the board comes second. So it's in alignment with that. And then to your comment, which is let someone else do that work. It comes to vote, it's rationalized, and this rationalized best practice is something that can be followed and be defensible.
Okay. So Ross, let's talk a little bit about that. Let me take an adjunct to that. I was the expert against Enron Corporation and their compensation. And in particular, out of the University of Texas was the Powers Report that discussed the fact that the compensation paid to the board of directors, which was heavily performance-based, blinded them to what they agreed to allow the executives to do what they did, that basically brought bankruptcy. So let me ask, I always hear this, even post-Enron, where directors come and say, why can't we be paid for performance? Thoughts on that, Ross?
Yeah, I think it's again, and this whole board thing is about governance. And you really have, I mean, I don't think you were talking to maybe the good old days or the bad old days where you could be on 12 boards. That doesn't exist anymore, and you have serious liability. So it's really you have to have forefront is governance. And, you know, with that said, you want to look at this from the point of view is, what's my motivation? And if it gets clouded by these enormous bonuses that Enron, you know, was seeing, why wouldn't they think the business is going great? You know, if everything must be going fantastic, I keep getting these big paychecks. So I do think there has to be, you know, if you wanted to pin me down, I don't believe in these astronomical board compensation. The only caveat is, you know, I guess in the marketplace you have to pay for the best. So there's some kind of market driving force here that I don't think we should oppose. But my vote would be the board should be compensated less than the executives, just from, again, the red face test in that they should get paid for what they're doing, but remember, it's about governance. That's their job. There should be a performance piece in that, because part of the governance is to make sure the company's performing.
Right.
But if it's overwhelming, I think that can be a problem. Again, it's the red face test. If they're making as much as the executives, or in some cases more, I don't think that passes that test.
So before I turn that over to Tim, Jay Lorsch, again from Harvard, would say, and I don't disagree, that boards are paid to be fiduciaries. Executives, back to Tim, your point, are paid to be executives. And again, it's interesting that right now in the energy market, you can imagine a lot of directors, especially with public and private companies, have lost everything from an equity perspective. And I find it interesting, Tim, that they'll call me and say, okay, I took all the cash that I was supposed to have and I put it all into equity, and now it's nothing. How can I get a makeup? And I'm like, well, there is no such thing. But what would you say about that, the issue of pay for performance versus the pay for fiduciary role?
I think it's clearly, to me, a pay for fiduciary role.
Okay.
I agree with a lot of your comments, or all of them in general, that at the highest level, it is governance, and our commitment as a board is to the shareholders. And in so doing that, and living that commitment, the performance of those executives, we have a large say in and a duty to make sure that we feel not only do we have the best executives running the company, because they are running the company. The board doesn't run the company. If you start mixing that, it gets very complicated. They should help them run the company, and they have to make decisions. The easiest, or the most clear, is on the CEO, but responsibilities for succession planning, but the performance of the company, and therefore the rewards and risks and downsides that go with the performance of the company, reside with the executive team. The governance and the fiduciary duty is to the shareholders. So lining up, the pay for performance should come from the performance that happens with the shareholders.
Here's the next side. When we start to think about that, and again, the three of us prepared with Greg for this. But what is the right amount, Tim? I mean, when we're talking about director comp, okay, so everybody knows, there's percentiles. In compensation, there's a range of reasonableness. We all know that. The IRS, basically from 1934 tax case law, started this concept that any job has a range of reasonableness. And we know that there's a median, there's a 25th percentile and a 75th, and of course there's a minimum and max. What's the right amount?
You think about compensation in our society in general, and why does a basketball player get $25 million a year for throwing a ball through a hoop, and teachers get paid what they get paid, and so why is that? Well, you could spend hours philosophizing about that, but that reality does provide a structure to what compensation's about. So to provide a framework, you have to kind of find your place in the world as a company and then a board of a company. So what's relevant there are, in a public company sense, it's what's your market cap, what industries are you in, who is your competition, not only for the products you might be producing, but the talent you're trying to attract, what's the regional differences you might have being here in Austin versus Boston versus San Francisco, and there's a framework of norms there. So select appropriately the type of companies that you want to compare yourself to. It's always often known as the peer group. That's a very important part of constructing your world. And then within that, the simplest way to describe it is the bigger companies tend to pay a little bit more, and the smaller companies within that frame tend to pay a little bit less. And you then have to decide, not just your size, but your performance does factor into that a little bit. But I would say generally what happens is people shoot for the norm, and then to Ross's point, you're not out in the extreme and exposing yourself or even setting bad practices for your company. So generally, pick the right peer group, tend toward the center, unless you have really good reasons to go beyond. And I think with executive comp, there are. With the board, it's not so much to me. I think it should be, kind of the norms for your industry and your company size.
Okay. Ross, let me take a follow-up on that. So the other night, I'm at a board meeting with a large oil and gas company up in Denver, Colorado. And I'm sitting there talking about director comp, and they wanted to actually, get into this discussion that we're having today. And I had to report to them that the board comp, like Tim was saying, was at the 26th percentile of the peer group that they had. Same peer group for the executives, but the executive peer group is at the 72nd percentile, and their performance is in the bottom 25th percentile. Do I have a problem that night?
Yeah, I think you have a big problem. I think the board compensation and the executive compensation need to be aligned. If you've got, what's that say about the board? Is this just a call-in board, or am I actually supposed to do something here? So I think, you need to follow the percentiles. For me, you need to be at the 50 plus percentile. And again, that comes back to the philosophy of the company.
Right.
If you're, and the kind of company, right? If you're a low margin company that's got lots of customers and lots of revenue, you'd have a different comp package than if you're in a growth mode where the board members maybe get no cash compensation in their, stock comped, and maybe they're investors, et cetera. So I think they have a big problem. I think they need to get alignment there. And, are they at the 26th because they have crappy board members? And, so, it needs to be aligned.
So just to let everybody know, he did not know the answer to that. That was a question I popped on him. I actually told him that they needed to get up to the 50th percentile, but now's not the time, because that would look odd in next year's proxy that they gave themselves a raise. And I also said it's probably a good thing to think about negative discretion as it relates to the executives in the annual incentive plan they had, which was pushing them up when their stock had gone down. So again, trying to make sure that we're thinking about not just what's good, sound process, Tim, as you all have talked about, but also how does it appear to people in the marketplace? And so that's how we did. What's also interesting about what Jay Lorsch, he wrote a book years ago, which I found absolutely helpful for everybody about director comp. I never had seen this because, one of the things we're talking about is looking at tables, the NACD thing that they put out for board of director comp. But Jay boiled it down to something very interesting that we cross-check at Longnecker, and that's the amount of hours expended by your board. And if you ever think about that, that really helps. The average board member for a public company spends 180 to 220 hours a year. And Jay's point is, if when you divide the total compensation of your board member by the hours expended, if they're getting paid probably anywhere between like $500 to $1,000, kind of a good partner level for a law firm or someone like that, you're okay. But a lot of the compensation, if you look at for directors that gets in the news, 1.5 million divided by 200. That's not a hard one to sit there and say, wow, is there anybody out there from a professional service perspective that gets that kind of money? I recently had a foundation up in Fort Worth. That was their issue. It was a foundation. It was a charitable foundation, but they were giving out money, and it was going to be a working board. They weren't going to hire executives. They were really struggling with the surveys they saw, and all we did was spend 2 days talking about what their time allotment would be. And when we were done with that, we actually came up with a good number. The first year would be $35,000. The next year would probably be $50,000. There's no stock, of course. But getting back to the idea of time, I think also gives us a little bit of sanity as to whether or not that board or that board member was worth the time that we paid them.
It is interesting what you brought up there, the optics. So the question they asked you at that board meeting, whatever it was, I forget the numbers, 26th percentile for the board, 72nd for the executives, but the company's in the bottom. Well, our society views that data in the moment. But oftentimes when those decisions were made, what to pay those executives or the directors, things could have been very different. The situation could be different. So the time delay between when the decisions were paid, what the stock was at when you made decisions like that, and then what it might be worth 6 months later sometimes, or typically when the proxy comes out and the shareholder meetings, that to me speaks to being more conservative in what you're doing. But I also don't think I agree that that's a problem situation that needs to be dealt with. But you don't necessarily have to look at yourselves as a board and say, we screwed up, if the facts and the time, what you knew at the time. That doesn't mean you don't take action and correct, but sometimes the optics can be very different than the realities of when decisions were made.
And we did not talk about this. This is a superb point, by the way, everybody. It's something the SEC is dealing with the public companies. Private don't have to deal with it as much. But the SEC, for years, when they put down exec pay and board pay, it is on what's called grant date fair market value of the grant that you get. And so if there's a 3-year vest, they don't care about the 3-year vest. They just say what the total amount was, and it has no correlation to what's actually realized. And so what Tim just talked about is a really key issue that the SEC is presently looking into that doesn't just take the accounting, which the accounting is always going to be bigger. It's going to be worst case, this is what you're going to get for all intents and purposes. And they're going to look at it and compare and contrast that in the future, we're hoping, to basically say, here's what was realized. Because Tim's right. Years ago, a company called Plains Exploration, they had a huge grant. One of the biggest mistakes boards can oftentimes make is, as opposed to figuring out the dollar amount to grant for stock, is to say we're going to grant 10,000 shares. And when it was 10,000 shares at $10 a share, it wasn't a lot. When it's 10,000 shares at $78 a share, all of a sudden you have $780 plus $200,000 in cash. You're at $980,000. You're at the top 5% of your peer group, and that probably causes an issue. But back to what Tim said, when it finally vested, the stock had dropped in the Great Recession of 2008 down to 15, but they had to pay tax on the grant that they had, which was interesting, and they had the optics of making $780,000, and to say that the board was incensed because of the inappropriateness of what they realized was amazing. So I think this issue of targeted, the accounting, and realized is a key issue. Ross, what are your thoughts?
It's all best practices. In the case you said in your company in Denver, I actually would say they screwed up. I mean, someone wasn't watching the ball here and getting this out of alignment. Clearly the executives were taken care of in some fashion when they're at the 78 percentile. So I think this all comes back to how are the executives being comped, and we're moving to RSUs for this reason in stock grants. So I mean, this stuff has to all be in line, because the board is the fiduciary and governance piece of it. They should be looking at how the optics are, but even again, it's governance. Who cares about the optics? It's really what's the right thing to do, and on the stand, can you stand up to this scrutiny? So I think it should be in line, and if it's always in line and actively managed, this is what people are there for.
Sometimes it works really good when you're a moderator and everybody says things that you're really excited about, because he just talked about the fact that boards are moving to RSUs and RSAs, restricted stock units, restricted stock awards. There is a reason for that. The Powers report, again, out of University of Texas, said the use of stock options, since they're so highly leveraged, is what blinded the board of directors at Enron. A Harvard study just came out that not only validated that, but said be careful with stock options as it relates to executives. Don't make it the only thing you grant them. Make it part of a diversified mix to where they're not just trying to leverage up. So
and again, that's best practices.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it comes to your comment of everything has to be in aligned best practices, governance. I mean, this is all part of it.
Well, and back to your red face test, every public and private company we consult with, we will not ever sign off on stock options or anything that's an appreciation vehicle for a board member. We will for executives, but we will make sure it's a whole value award, RSUs or RSAs, for the directors along with cash, to make sure, again, it's as plain vanilla bland as possible and they're getting paid for fiduciary. And you're right, Tim, if the company performs on their watch, the stock they got granted goes up, but it's not leveraged. Because again, most people, usually with an appreciation vehicle like an SAR or an option, you have to grant 3 to 4 times that amount to get the same value and risk associated with a whole value or restricted stock award, restricted stock unit award. So you can see how the leverage is 3 to 4 times. For executives, again, they can play that a little bit more as long as you've got a good admiral, the board of directors, making sure they're doing what needs to be done.
When things work good is when you have a really competent head of human resources, your chief people officer, because this person, manages this and runs this. So one of the things I'm looking at when I go on a board is, do we have the right person that's running this? Because a board's not going to run it.
Right.
And you get into these jams like you have up in Denver because someone wasn't a board. I mean, I guess a board member could have said something about this, but really the executive is the head of HR. So you really have to have a person that's competent, that's watching all these issues. The issues you brought up, that's a recent thing. I mean, that's in the last 5 to 7 years that really everyone switched to RSUs for this reason.
Exactly.
And if you weren't paying attention or you didn't have a HR comp person that was in that seat making those decisions, you'd miss it.
What's the difference between a private board compensation and a public board compensation, if any?
In my experience with a private company, you adapt your role and the compensation, therefore, on a private company with the circumstances of that company. You're much more involved and affected by the performance and the needs of the company. For example, if you're on a company that has some venture capital behind them, they can be typically sensitive to dilution and stock type items. So they may be pushing more for cash. On the other hand, the company may be having cash issues, and in that year you just say, okay, well then save your cash and try and take a little bit more equity that year, or you might not do anything, just say, okay, I'm here to help. I'm looking at the longer term picture. Just no compensation this year, or anything in between in combinations, or hey, the first 6 months cash flow looked a lot better. We can go back, and you have a lot more freedom in that regard. And I think that's appropriate for in a private setting, because you really want to be tuned in. Whereas these best practices and the way the industry works when you're a public company, you have to follow those to some degree.
So Ross, let me talk a little bit about, Ralph called me a while back, and he's one of the best I've ever been around strategizing for the people he works with here in Austin. And we had an interesting discussion about private companies, about how private companies will sometimes do two things. One of two things, I should say. They'll hire a board advisory group versus a board. Board advisory group is really there to give advice maybe to the family. They're getting paid a little bit, but it is strictly advice. Whereas some private companies, especially ones that are getting ready, their startups are getting ready to go public, something like that, that board's a little bit different. Talk a little bit about maybe the compensation and responsibilities between those two.
For me, there's a very big difference between private and public. In a venture-backed stuff, which I've primarily been in, who you have on the board, which answers your question directly, is the folks that have written the checks. When they write a check, they get a position on the board. That's part of the deal terms, either 1 or 2 board seats, depending on the size. And I think that's perfect alignment for a private venture-backed company. Their interest is in growing the business, which is all around making it a successful business, so that then when they become successful, all of those folks get out, and we have what you call an independent board, which is what you need at that point. So I think there's perfect alignment there. An independent board early on, I don't know what value they would have, because the motives are aligned when you're venture-backed and private. And then this comes to answer your point. So if you do want a board when you're private or venture-backed, an advisory board is there for advice. You don't really need the fiduciary responsibility at that point. It's not until you get bigger and you can see that you're going to have to go public and have more scrutiny that you want, and they call it independent board, which means there's no money behind it. So I do think that there's a perfect alignment. Okay,
Tim, your thoughts?
I think the bigger picture with a private company is really what phase are you in? What's the condition of the company? What's the exit strategy? What are the dynamics they're facing? And the board or an advisory board are mechanisms, or the board can adapt to those, and the advisory board is one of the mechanisms you can use based on the phase that you're in the company. So there's more flexibility,
Yeah.
not in the governance sense. You're still, you got to be driven by what's the right thing, and not that, just how you go about the implementation of it. There's more flexibility and just more dynamics, I think.
Yeah, and to answer your question, I think those advisory boards should be, stock option based, and shouldn't, depending on the size, but I think they should be just option based.
Okay.
And have expertise in the area, right? That's what
Right.
you're specifically looking for. I don't know, most of your venture-backed stuff is going to have money folks anyhow, so they're going to be handling the governance from a financial point of view. You don't really need outside advice on that necessarily, but you might need industry-specific advice.
A great point you just made, expertise. I was put on a publicly traded company years ago for my strategy background, and when I got to the board, out of the 7 outside board members, there was 1 strategy guy, there was 1 oil guy, and there were 5 attorneys. Make matters worse, it was offshore and Macondo happened, and the attorneys the entire time, we always discussed how we wanted to sue, or they wanted to sue the government. I always felt like maybe our expertise was a little bit more heavily weighted than it needed to be on the legal side. Let's talk about that, because that's one of the things we shared as we were preparing for this over the last month. The expertise or the diversification of a board, how does it look? Because that can impact the way compensation is designed.
Yeah, I think it's important to, I'm on a bank board, and, there is a lot of bankers there, or ex-bankers, and there's a lot of, it's a big community bank, and there's a lot of local businesses in there. Now, in this case, the local businesses are great, so it really is a diverse, at first when I walked into the board, I was thinking, this is curious, but, I sat down and paid attention. That diversity of those businesses there really gets a pulse for the bank on how they should be servicing their customers, and they've really got, they're tied into community banks. Community banks are very dependent on their geolocation. So that diversity is important, and the expertise that's on in the banking case, farmers, ranchers, businessmen are in that on that board. So I think it is. I mean, now cybersecurity is a big deal. I'm getting, recruited on cybersecurity and technology. Now they're starting up technology committees, which didn't exist before. And in the, it used to be prior to that, as if boards were loaded with attorneys, or, I hope there's no banker. I'm a banker, so I can say that. And then bankers, right? So someone that can lead the audit committee, right? So I think expertise is important, and it's shifting now. And then, of course, this report is fantastic, by the way. I couldn't endorse this comp report more, but I think there's also diversity from gender, ethnicity, really needs to be on these boards, because if they're representing the customers.
I was going to say that NACD does a great job when they have these breakfasts and they do the cybersecurity ones for you. Just a word of caution, bring antidepressants, because after you listen to them talk about that, you find out that everybody is hacked. It's just to what extent. It's very depressing. I was going through the fellowship program about 1.5 years ago, and it was a 3 and 4 hour program with an ex-FBI guy, and everybody got up and they were just like, where's the bar? I mean, somewhere to go. It is, but Ross is right. Cybersecurity is a big issue, and again, a lot of board members haven't gotten used to that yet. Tim, your thoughts about diversification or the makeup of the board?
Absolutely. You have to actively construct a board. And I think that is another area where the executive management team has a large voice in that. Now, it's ultimately in most boards the nominating and governance committee, but look at all the dimensions of the company. Some of the obvious ones are what industry you're in, industry relevance, but there's a lot more to that. The diversity, the human resource aspects, culture. Is it a growing company? Is it an established company? What kind of industry is it in? If it's a fast-moving kind of industry, finding somebody that's lived that, whether it's that exact industry or not, is important. Think about what the company needs. Listen to the executive team and what they would like to work with and partner with, because again, back to that active engagement, which a point you made earlier, and I kind of took it another way, was about the time. and you did some quick math on you're compensated for this, and roughly they do 200 hours a year. I think that's another good litmus test. I think those are the kind of things that form the framework of sanity with your compensation practices. But also it can miss the point if you get too simplistic there, because you hire board members for their expertise. I mean, frankly, they can, in 2 sentences, say something that's so incredibly wise, it took them 15 seconds to say those words, and it made a huge impact on the company.
Right.
So that expertise, the skill level that you're trying to attract on a board is not exactly just time-based. Furthermore, again, if you have an engaged board, they're spending time at the offices, hopefully face-to-face, but on the phone also, engaged with advice and mentoring and taking their years of experience and what they've been through and helping the company improve in that way too, not just the formal meetings and committee meetings and meeting notes and that sort of thing.
Well, and I think, again, I'll go back to what Jay Lorsch has talked about and some other governance people. What kind of committees do you have? And you just mentioned it. You've got a comp committee, and everybody on the comp committee, no one has any HR background. Audit committees can't do that now with public companies because of Sarbanes-Oxley, which is interesting. Or a governance committee and no one knows anything about governance. I remember sitting on a publicly traded board, probably about 6 years ago, and the consultant we hired came in and wanted to give us an impassioned plea of how we didn't have to pay attention to FLSA and overtime. The other board members who were CEOs of Fortune 1000 companies looked at me and said, "What do you think? That could save us a lot of money." I said, "No." There is no such thing as not having to pay overtime to the non-exempt people if they work over the 40. So it's kind of an interesting thing that a lot of times we line up, and if we're not careful, the CEO or even the board will line up with people that are like themselves, but not diversified to where you can have the kind of discussion or friction that you possibly need. All right, so one of the things that Greg did, he's not here, but he wanted to make sure, he and Ralph made sure that they wrote to us last night. And I got to ask this question before we go into the audience questions, and that is trends in board pay. Tim, I'll start with you, but that was our lead in what NACD put out to everybody. And Greg and they wanted to make sure that we actually talked about that. So what are some trends that you see before we go into the audience?
I think Ross and you have touched on a few, that where we've evolved to is this, let's again, a little oversimplified, but these peer groups, 50th percentile, some balance of cash and equity, more and more these days, that's a little bit centered, a little bit more skewed towards the equity, which I think is fine, and more it's RSUs and RSAs, as you both were talking about, for some of the reasons that you mentioned there. So you're seeing, and this is largely from the public company perspective, back to my earlier comments on private, there's a little difference there, and it can change from year to year. But those practices, you're seeing board members, I think I read in some of the NAC materials, like average of a 9-year tenure or something thereabouts. So you have to keep that in mind too in your board compensation. They should be thinking longer term, and it shouldn't be, hopefully, you're constructed a board, and even with practices today, a lot of boards go into yearly, have to get nominated and voted in yearly. But the compensation should have a longer term focus to it. And so that managing to the medium and the equity portion, that's where you should stand to gain if those shareholders gain over that time period.
Ross?
I think the trend, I was just thinking about that, the trend is, I look out here on this audience, and I think the trend is we're seeing a turnover in boards. I mean, boards are putting in limitations on the tenure and the age limitations. So we're seeing a turnover in a lot of these boards where the older board members are rolling off, we're becoming more modern, more progressive. These things we're talking about, best practices for board compensation that aligns with executive compensation. I think these are new concepts. So I think that's a trend, is this modernization and best practices. And we're really gonna see a turnover in the next few years. There's a lot of older folks on some of the boards I'm on, and there's the companies that are going to win are going to have modern, progressive, younger boards.
The size of the board as it affects comp. And we actually do that analysis at Longnecker. If you have 3 versus your peer group average is 7, how does that impact compensation, or should it impact compensation if you have, let's say your average or median of the boards that you're competing against is 5 and you have 7 or you have 3? Tim, how should that impact compensation?
I would say you have to have the right number in mind based on, again, what are the needs of the company and how do you construct the board. I don't think you should get too into, well, we should have 5 because everybody else has 5. What do we need? The compensation aspect of that, generally speaking, you're paying your directors the same. With today, the exception being if you're involved with a committee or a chairman of that committee, there's a small marginal differential for the extra work that is involved there. And my experience over my years being on the board is that the amount of work has gone up. The liability, the scrutiny, the say on pay, if you're talking compensation, the visibility has gone up as well. And so the differentials are justified, but you're still in a band that each director is paid roughly the same. Of course, if you're an independent lead or, there's some other asterisks on that, but generally speaking. And so if that's the case, get the right number for what your needs are.
Okay. Ross?
I think it's dependent on the business, frankly. Agreed with everything you said, and it's very dependent on the business. If you're, a private venture-backed thing, it could be 2, 3, 5. I would be alarmed if it's more than 5, unless it's a very big on the way to becoming a public. And then depends on the business. Bank boards are typically big boards because if they're private, then it's a bunch of bank holders that have money in the bank and a significant amount of money, so they're getting represented. If it's a public one, it's smaller. So it depends. I guess big boards scare me and little boards scare me. So again, I want to be in the middle.
Well, the same dynamics apply whether it's a board meeting or any other kind of meeting.
Right.
You want to be productive, and if you get too many people in there, especially too many opinionated people, are they as productive as they can be? So that's a great point.
It's funny, when I was, many years ago when La Quinta was taken over by the Bass brothers, I was a very young Pete Marwick partner. And I walked into the first board meeting and there were 13 of them. And I had a feeling that maybe that was too many. Eventually it would slim down, but you are exactly right. With 13 people with all kinds of different interests, I remember thinking to myself, I may have gotten up to my highest level at that present time, so it was intense. But conversely, you make a good point. If you're public, I'm talking public right now with what we've talked about, and I've seen this before where you have 3 board members, outside board members, and all 3 sit on the audit, the comp, and the governance and nominating committee. I have to admit to y'all that I look and I kind of go, wow, y'all are really talented. Either that or you don't really realize the risk you've just taken on. Mm-hmm. I mean, that would seem to me with a public company that would be too few, only from a standpoint of all the prep you have to do, because I would imagine that's not going to be 220 hours a year for them. That would probably be closer to 350.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I had one question here. Really good trend. Before Sarbanes-Oxley came into place, there was an interesting trend on director compensation where meeting fees were being put into retainers. After Sarbanes-Oxley hit, everybody came out, changed charters, but meeting fees became something everybody wanted to highlight, all the meetings that a board was having to make sure everybody knew that they were engaged. Now, as we sit here today, probably close to 50% of the public companies in the United States are going back to including meeting fees into a retainer. Ross, thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is a trend where you're seeing the board meetings become, the actual board meetings become smaller, and the committee meetings are where the majority of the work is done, which I think is a best practice, and I think, frankly, it's a great practice. It avoids the 3 board member boards
Right.
issue that you had with, and it also deals with the bigger boards where there's a subcommittee that's focused on that particular subject, be it compensation, risk, in the banking, there's all kinds of subcommittees around just the risk. So I think that is a recognition of subcommittees should really run a board, and they come with recommendations.
Okay.
I agree with that. Well, obviously, you have meetings and they're documented and all that, but that's a common denominator. That how do you, if you meet for 2 hours versus 3 days, there's a big difference there in terms of what that matters. And I also agree that more and more, and I think this is the way it should be, is these committees are where the real work and the heavy lifting that we do as a board, which is greatly supported by the executive management team in most cases, I would say. That's where the real action and wisdom and studying and articulating and arguing and negotiating goes on. And so that's really where and that's not in a meeting typically, that's offline.
Okay, new trend. Okay, back on that, your point. University of Chicago says that today's compensation committee is yesterday's audit committee, and tomorrow's nominating governance committee will be today's compensation committee. Sorry about that, but that's how they say it. So after Sarbanes-Oxley, we saw audit committee chairs and even audit committees paid a premium for what they were doing. Mm-hmm. We're not seeing that right now with comp necessarily, but I will say a lot of the top schools around the United States from a governance perspective believe that should be happening, but they're also warning us that the selection of directors is going to become more important. Back to your point about the turnover. Thoughts about that, Ross?
Yeah, I don't think the comp committee is as hard as the audit committee, but again, I'm not a finance guy, so I don't think it's that big of a job. I mean, I think you have best practices, and come back to your first point, if you've got a strong VP in that or C-level folk in the HR role, they should be doing this stuff anyhow. So they should be, hey, our board's here, this is where it sits in the percentile. So I don't think it's as much work in the comp committee. I think it's more work in, if you're in risk or technology expertise or finance. So I guess I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it should just be best practice, and they should be aligned with all the other compensation of the company. That's my answer.
Tim, would it surprise you on that note that it's important who you put on your comp committee? Because would it surprise any of the panelists that if you put a sitting CEO of a publicly traded company on the comp committee, that he or she may be a little bit more nervous about any decisions they make on that comp committee, or maybe be right down the middle of the line? Does that make any difference?
I think it always makes a difference who you select to be on the committees or on the board for that matter. Okay. But back to your comment, or the statement there about, I think where that's coming from is where's the scrutiny, where's the trend in scrutiny, and
right.
With Sarbanes-Oxley and really for a long time with the audit committee, it's been on that, and rightly so, and all the regulations and accounting practices and stuff they have to keep up with. I agree with Ross that that's a big load for the executives and their teams as well as the board. So, but I think what that's reflective of, okay, now compensation seems to be getting a lot of the spotlight, and there's say on pay now. So there's the shareholders get to vote with how they think the compensation committee chairman's doing, basically, and of course everyone that supports that. So I think that's what it's talking about. And then, hey, what's the next spotlight that's probably going to be shown? So I think that's true in that sense. But I agree that the audit committee is still so intense, and yes.
And I don't think the CEO should be on the comp committee.
And it's interesting, in the old days that was actually happened. Yeah. Actually, many years ago, 30 years ago, it was not unusual for inside executives on the board usually the CEO and the CFO, were actually on the board getting paid board pay. And about 30 years ago, they rolled that into the packages and realized that wasn't good. So it is interesting how we have evolved from a governance perspective. Ross, I've got one of my favorite questions, is kind of an adjunct, is how do you feel about the chairman and CEO role being together?
I think that's a bad idea. I think the chairman should be independent. Again, it comes back to the governance and fiduciary. It just doesn't look, it looks bad to me. And red face test, it brings up this issue in, do we have the right alignment and the right view from the outside? So I don't think the chairman and CEO should be the same seat.
Tim?
I have a bias towards that being the case, but I really do think the company and the situation needs to be considered. If you have a good justification for having both roles, I'm okay with that. But it would be, okay, we're going this direction, convince me otherwise, which the direction being a separate chairman and CEO.
Yeah, I take my answer back. Depending on the size of the company, smaller companies can have that early on, but again, it's about nimbleness, rocking and rolling and moving forward. I wouldn't want a venture company, I wouldn't want the lead investor being the chairman,
right?
For example. So in that case, I'd want the CEO to be the chairman, but where it's a bigger company, where it's governance and fiduciary responsibility, I wouldn't want that.
So just to add to that, the reason I love that question is probably about 3-4 years ago, our company was asked to actually analyze this issue. And I have to agree, the bias is to have them separated. However, what we found was, to the extent that you do not separate, that you have a chairman CEO negotiating against a CEO who's not the chairperson, that the chairman CEO will use that in a negotiated advantage against that person. And so we spent a lot of time, it was about a 6-month study, several companies asked us to do it, and it was not what I was counting on, but it was interesting to a person, the chairman CEOs that had the joint role looked forward to negotiating against people that might just have the CEO role or the president. Now, what that means, I don't know. It just was interesting that it was something that was used as a negotiating advantage when basically buying assets from company to company.
I mean, ultimately, your responsibility is to hire and fire the CEO.
Right.
is the worst case, if you're ever in that situation. So that makes it tougher when they're the chairman.
You can pay yourself, you can fire yourself.
Yeah, right.
That's a nice role.
Another question, and these are all really good. I wish I could get to all of them. Superb. A superstar board. Somebody said, what if you have a superstar board? And I think oftentimes companies will look for that, where they'll ask a board not just to be fiduciaries, but be a networking fiduciary board, to where all of a sudden they almost speed line them a lot quicker from a market perspective, to where they have contacts that will open up. James Baker the other night talked about the fact that oftentimes boards would like him to be there so that he could actually open up doors. What about a superstar board? Will they be compensated a little bit different, Tim?
I think you should always strive to have a superstar board,
That's
right?
a good point, yes.
Well, I do, and you should try and find the best match for the needs of the company, and they're probably maybe referring to bigger names or bigger impact, and that's probably going to come down to, will that person be attracted to the company, not as so specifically to the compensation, but I think you should always try for those, and you always have to be smart. If somebody comes in and brings that kind of talent to the board, then yes, you should consider what probably would be a startup package for them. And then I think what you were talking about there in terms of the networking, that's a key part of why that's
Right.
a talent, if you will, or a skill that you bring to the table as being a board member. So I would expect that.
Ditto on that. I mean, the one piece I'd add to it is I'm not always sure that a superstar executive, especially maybe in the early stage or just went public, I'm not sure Mark Zuckerberg is a great board member.
Right.
So, you have to be, having him on your board could help your business, no doubt, and there'd be a value in having him on your board, so I wouldn't recommend against that. But I'm not sure if that's really, great for the board, and if you had a board of those, is business getting really done at that point. So there's a balance in there.
We have
Sure,
2
they
minutes.
might default, oh yeah, just listen to what Mark says.
Exactly. 2 minutes. Final comments, Ross, to people in the audience about board comp.
I don't get, in reading this report, which is fabulous, again, I'll endorse it. It's a great report. I think the comp is going to be just like regular comp anywhere. It's going to be market-based. For me, this sounds very cliche, but you want to get on a board where you feel like you can add value, where you've got an interest. I'm looking for boards where I can do this 15-second comment and add a tremendous amount of value because they need my expertise, because that seated then in a very real, and I can't stress it enough, very real governance and fiduciary responsibility. That's your job there, and so you'd have that up front as your job.
Tim, your final
Agree.
comments.
I think the pay has to be meaningful relative to the time and also the liabilities that exist and scrutiny and that a board member puts. But have a good process, involve the executive management team, look at your peers, be reasonable. Don't be extreme, be reasonable. And that, I don't think that's, in the end, if you do those things, that's not what drives most board members wanting to be associated with that.
And I interviewed, I'd add to my question, when you talk about board comp, a big piece for me is the executives you're working with. So I've worked on startups where I've had a financial interest, and I'm thinking I'm on the board to protect my money in there, and I'm thinking, oh man, this is not going well, because I don't have a great executive team, or I need to switch something out there. Whereas with this bank in the example, great executive team, it makes it so much easier when you can go in there and your experience, you can say, wow, they've got this under control. This I don't need to worry about. They need a little help here. So, if I was paid a ton of money and had to work with a maniac team, that wouldn't be worth it, right? Because then your liability would go up and you're thinking, oh my God, how do I get uninvolved in this? I'm going to get sued pretty quick. So I think there's that whole for me, that's actually foremost. You couldn't pay me a bunch of money, and I think you guys would agree when you're thinking, wow, this is a mess.
Right. Well, good. Well, I want to say thank you to Ralph, NACD, to Tim and Ross. Behind the scenes for the last 6 months, Ralph's been working on this. It was that important. These guys, we've all been working on it now for about a month with Greg. He's not here, but I really do appreciate the preparation, everything that we talked about. Appreciate you all being here. Again, thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Brett.